There is an emotion you have felt, many times probably, that you have almost certainly never named correctly. Not because you are not self-aware, but because this particular emotion is designed to prevent itself from being named, to keep itself hidden, to make the person feeling it believe that the feeling itself is the proof of what it is telling them. It is not anger, though it often wears anger as a coat. It is not sadness, though it lives underneath most sadness. It is not anxiety, though it drives most anxiety. It is not arrogance, though some people build entire personalities around it to keep it from showing. It is not the need to be right, the need to be liked, the need to be perfect, the need to disappear, though it is the engine behind all of those needs. It is shame, and it is the most painful emotion in the human catalog. Not because it hurts most acutely, grief can be more acute, fear can be more immediate, but because shame attacks the self at its foundation. It does not say, "I did something bad." It says, "I am something bad." And a person who believes at some level that they are fundamentally flawed, fundamentally unworthy, fundamentally too much or not enough to be fully loved, that person will organize their entire life around managing that belief. Every pattern in this series, every dynamic we have explored, every relationship that repeated itself in ways that made no sense, shame is underneath almost all of it. This episode is the one the whole series has been building toward, not because shame is the only thing, but because it is the most hidden thing, the one that operates most completely out of sight, driving the most significant decisions of a person's life and receiving the least direct attention. By the end of this video, you will be able to see it in yourself, in the people around you, in the patterns that have always felt mysterious. And seeing it clearly, without flinching, is the beginning of the only thing that actually dissolves it. Stay with me. This one goes all the way down. Most people use shame, guilt, and embarrassment as if they are the same emotion with different intensities. They are not. They are three fundamentally different psychological experiences, and confusing them has consequences, because the thing that heals each one is completely different. Embarrassment is the most surface of the three. It is the hot flush of being seen doing something you wished no one had seen, spilling something, mispronouncing a word, being caught in a small social failure. Embarrassment is self-conscious and uncomfortable, but it passes. It does not reach the foundations of the self. And crucially, it almost always has a social component of lightness. Most embarrassing moments become stories we tell against ourselves because the distance between our ideal self and our actual self in that moment is small enough to be laughed at. Guilt is more serious and more productive. Guilt says, "I did something bad." It is behavior-focused. It is the response of a conscience that has registered a gap between what you did and what you value. And because it is focused on the behavior rather than the self, guilt can actually motivate repair. The person who feels genuine guilt wants to make it right, to apologize, to change, to close the gap. Guilt, properly felt, is one of the most functional emotions in the human repertoire. It is the emotional mechanism of accountability. Shame is categorically different. Shame says, "I am bad," not the behavior, the self. "I am defective. I am unlovable. I am too broken, too needy, too weak, too much, not enough." And because the target of shame is the self rather than a behavior, it cannot be resolved by changing the behavior. You cannot apologize your way out of shame. You cannot achieve your way out of it. You cannot be loved enough or successful enough, or good enough to make shame quiet, because shame lives in the part of the self that sits below achievement, below relationship, below any external evidence of worth. It is a wound in the foundation, and no amount of building on top of it makes the foundation solid. The researcher Brené Brown, after a decade of studying shame across thousands of interviews, arrived at this: shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Not that we did something flawed, that we are something flawed. That distinction between the behavior and the being is the entire distance between guilt and shame, and it is the distance between an emotion that can heal and one that, without the right kind of attention, only deepens. Shame is not born. No child arrives in the world believing they are fundamentally unworthy. They arrive needing, loudly, without apology, completely. They cry for food, for warmth, for contact, for attention, without any sense that these needs are excessive or wrong. The sense that they are excessive and wrong, that needing is something to be ashamed of, is learned, taught, delivered, usually without intention, by the people who loved the child most.
It is delivered in the tone that says, "Your feelings are too big for this room," in the comparison to a sibling who does not need as much, in the withdrawal of affection when the child fails, not the withdrawal of approval, which is natural and appropriate, but the withdrawal of warmth, of connection, of the basic message that you are still loved even when you have fallen short. It is delivered by the parent who communicates in 100 small ways that the child's value is conditional on their performance, their behavior, their emotional management, their ability to not be too much of whatever they most naturally are. It can also be delivered in a single moment, a public humiliation, an adult's contempt toward a child's failure, the experience of being exposed, of having something private, something tender, something not yet ready to be seen, held up to ridicule or dismissal. Shame, in its most acute form, is always relational. It requires a witness. It is the experience of being seen as defective by someone whose gaze matters. And the earliest and most formative shamings almost always occur in the presence of the people whose gaze matters most. The cruelest thing about shame in childhood is that the child does not conclude the adult is wrong. The child concludes the adult is right, because the adult is the entire world, because the adult's perception of the child is the child's primary source of self-knowledge. And so the shame becomes not just a feeling, but a belief that is then carried into every subsequent relationship, every room, every version of the self that is constructed in the years that follow. And that belief runs silently, continuously, beneath the surface of everything, until someone or something brings it into the light and shows it for what it actually is. Not the truth about who you are, the conclusion of a child who had no other explanation available.
Shame is the most likely emotion to be misidentified, both by the person feeling it and by the people observing them. Because shame is so unbearable that the psyche almost never allows it to present as itself. Instead, it gets covered, immediately, automatically, with whatever protective layer the person has learned works best. And those protective layers look, from the outside, like completely different emotions and personality traits. 1. Anger and rage. the most common cover for shame in men and in anyone raised to believe that vulnerability is dangerous. When shame is triggered by criticism, by failure, by rejection, by being seen in a way that activates the core wound, the anger arrives so quickly it feels like the primary emotion, and it is expressed outward toward the person or situation that triggered it, rather than inward toward the wound it is covering. The psychologist June Tangney calls this shame rage. It is the rage of someone who cannot tolerate being seen as defective, who converts the unbearable exposure of shame into an attack. The anger feels like power. Underneath it is the most profound helplessness. 2. Perfectionism. The attempt to outrun shame through achievement. If I am perfect, if there is nothing that can be criticized, nothing that can be pointed to as a failure, nothing less than the highest standard in everything visible, then the defect at the core cannot be confirmed. Perfectionism is not high standards. High standards are healthy, flexible, and can tolerate imperfect outcomes without existential crisis. Perfectionism is the belief that imperfection proves the shameful thing is true. It is not driven by the desire to do well. It is driven by the terror of what doing badly would confirm. And because perfection is never sustainably achievable, the perfectionist lives in a state of permanent low-level shame management, always one visible failure away from exposure. 3. People-pleasing and disappearing. The strategy of making oneself as unobjectionable as possible. If I never disagree, never take up too much space, never have needs that inconvenience anyone, never say the thing that might create conflict, then there is nothing to be criticized, nothing to be exposed. The people pleaser has learned that their authentic self, their real preferences, their actual needs, their honest reactions is too much or not enough or simply dangerous to show. And so they construct a version of themselves entirely around what is acceptable to others. The result is a life that looks cooperative and low maintenance and is experienced from the inside as a profound and exhausting loneliness. Because the person being liked is not the real person, and the real person has not been seen in so long, they have begun to wonder if they still exist. 4. Grandiosity and superiority. The exact opposite strategy with the same function. If I am the best, the most successful, the most intelligent person in this room, then the defect cannot reach me. The grandiose person has built a fortress of superiority around their shame, and they defend it with the particular ferocity of someone who knows, at some level below consciousness, what is inside it. This is the narcissistic defense described in the very first episode of this series. The grandiosity is not confidence. Real confidence is quiet. Grandiosity is loud, because it has to be. It has to be loud enough to drown out the voice underneath that is still saying what the child was told all those years ago. 5. Numbing and addiction. Alcohol, substances, food, work, screens, sex, shopping, exercise taken to an extreme. Any reliable mechanism for turning the volume of the internal experience down far enough that the shame becomes manageable. The researcher Gabor Mate, who has spent his career working with people in addiction, argues consistently that addiction is not primarily a disease of pleasure-seeking. It is a disease of pain relief. The question to ask about every addiction, Mate says, is not why the high, but why the pain? And the pain, in almost every case he has encountered across decades of clinical work, has shame at its center. The numbing works. until it becomes its own source of shame, and then the cycle deepens. Every single one of these masks was a solution. At some point, in some environment, the strategy that the mask represents was the best available response to an unbearable feeling. The child who became a perfectionist was the child for whom imperfection was genuinely dangerous. The child who disappeared was the child for whom visibility was genuinely unsafe. The masks are not failures of character. They are the ingenuity of a person who needed to survive something and found a way. The problem is not that the mask was put on. The problem is that it has been worn so long that the person inside it has forgotten they are wearing one. And the mask is now generating its own problems, its own costs, its own suffering on top of the original wound it was built to cover. Shame is the primary barrier to genuine intimacy. Not the only barrier, but the primary one. Because intimacy requires being known, really known, the actual self, including the parts that are not carefully managed, not performing, not presenting the best available version. And the person who carries deep shame cannot allow themselves to be fully known, because being known means risking exposure. And exposure, in the experience of the shame-carrying person, means confirmation of the thing they have spent their life trying to disprove. So they get close, but not all the way. They love, but with one part of themselves held back, just in case. They are generous, attentive, present, but the most private rooms of the self remain locked, and the person on the other side of the relationship can feel the wall, even if they cannot see it. They feel the held back. They feel the place where access is blocked, and they interpret it as a statement about themselves, about their trustworthiness, about the depth of the love, when it is actually a statement about what the shame-carrying person believes will happen if they open the door all the way. This is why the pattern in episode 2, the empath and the narcissist, exists at all. The narcissist, whose shame defense is grandiosity, cannot allow the vulnerability of genuine intimacy. The empath, whose shame wound often tells them they are only lovable when they are needed, cannot allow the vulnerability of simply being loved without earning it. Two people whose shame keeps them from the very thing they most need from each other. Two people whose walls touch without either being able to knock on them. The dynamic is tragic, and it is extraordinarily common, and it runs on shame the whole way through. The relationships that feel most alive, most real, most nourishing, most worth the risk of being in, are almost always the relationships where shame has been allowed to surface and has been met with something other than confirmation, where a person has shown the part of themselves that carries the deepest fear of rejection, and instead of rejection, found presence, found being held, found someone staying. That experience of bringing shame into the light and having it met with love rather than contempt is not just emotionally meaningful. It is, according to Brené Brown and the researchers who have followed her, the primary mechanism through which shame loses its power. Not insight, not analysis, not understanding shame intellectually, being seen in it and not abandoned. Shame cannot be thought away, it cannot be reasoned away, it cannot be achieved away, medicated away, numbed away, or willed away by deciding to feel differently. Every one of those strategies has been tried by almost everyone who carries deep shame, and every one of them manages the symptom while leaving the wound intact. Because shame is relational in its origin, it was built in relationship, in the gaze of someone whose judgment mattered, and it can only really heal in relationship, in the specific experience of being seen fully and vulnerably by someone who stays. The researcher Kristen Neff has spent her career studying self-compassion, which she defines specifically as treating yourself with the same warmth and understanding you would offer a good friend going through the same difficulty. Her research shows consistently that self-compassion is more effective than self-esteem in building genuine psychological resilience. The difference is important. Self-esteem requires you to feel good about yourself. Self-compassion only requires you to be kind to yourself. And the person carrying deep shame cannot feel good about themselves, but they can, with practice, learn to be kind to themselves in the moments when the shame is loudest. That practice looks like this. When you notice the shame, when you feel the contraction, the heat, the specific quality of wanting to disappear or attack or perform your way out of a moment, pause, name it. Not "I am terrible," but "this is shame, this is a feeling, it is not a fact." Then, in that pause, ask what you would say to a person you loved who was feeling exactly this, and say that to yourself. Not as a platitude, as a genuine act of attention toward the part of you that is in pain. And alongside the practice of self-compassion, seek out the relationships where shame can be spoken out loud. Not to everyone, not in every context, to one person or two who have demonstrated the capacity to hold what is most tender in you without flinching. Brené Brown calls these people shame-resilient connections. They are people who, when you say the thing you most fear saying, respond not with confirmation of the fear, but with recognition, with "me too," with "I know that feeling," with presence that says, "You are not alone in this, and this does not change what you are to me." That response, that simple, sustained presence in the face of exposure, is the antidote, not the cure, because healing from deep shame is not a single event. It is a practice, a direction, a gradual accumulation of experiences in which the thing you most feared showing is shown, and the world does not end. The relationship does not collapse. The person does not leave. And each time that happens, each time vulnerability is met with contempt rather than contempt, the shame loses a little of its authority, a little of its power to organize your life around its management, a little of its claim to be the truth about who you are, until one day, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly and undeniably, you realize it has been a long time since the shame ran the decision, and something else has taken its place, something quieter, something more genuinely yours, something that feels, for the first time in a long time, like simply being enough.
We began this series 9 episodes ago with narcissism, a condition rooted at its deepest level in shame so unbearable that the entire personality was reorganized to keep it from surfacing. We have moved through manipulation, self-deception, unfinished goodbyes, the patterns that repeat, the wounds that were carried from childhood. And every single one of those episodes has had the same thing at its center, even when we did not name it directly: shame. The belief that something fundamental is wrong with me. The life organized around ensuring that nobody finds out. And now we have named it, directly, without softening it or making it smaller than it is, because it deserves to be looked at full in the face. Not because looking at it is comfortable, but because the only thing that has ever truly diminished shame's power in every culture, in every era, across every variation of human experience that the research has examined, is exactly this: the willingness to see it, to name it, to say out loud, even if only to yourself in a quiet room, "This is the thing I have been carrying. This is what it is called, and it is not the truth about me. It is a wound, and wounds, given the right conditions, heal." You are not what the shame tells you you are. You are not the failure, the defect, the too much, the not enough. You are a person who was given a verdict by someone or something that did not have the right to deliver it, and who has been living under that verdict ever since, without a trial, without a defense, without anyone having the standing to tell you it was wrong. Consider this, that. Consider this the moment someone with standing tells you the verdict was wrong. You were never what the shame said you were, and you do not have to keep living as if you were. Owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing that we will ever do. Brené Brown. Own the story, all of it, including the part that the shame has been guarding. That part is not the worst of you, it is the most human of you, and it deserves the same love you have been giving everyone else. If this episode reached the place it was trying to reach, share it quietly with someone who is carrying something they have not yet been able to name. Leave a comment below, even just one word for what this brought up. Subscribe to this channel. Next episode, we begin something new, the psychology of identity. Who you actually are beneath every role, every wound, every mask, every story you have told yourself. That one is next.